Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. I have bought a Canon 1D Mark III, not a 1DS Mark III, not the 1DX Mark III, the regular 1D Mark III. It's a big beast, and it's from another era, an older era. And I think I got a pretty solid deal on it. It was on the E of bays. It was listed as is or for parts or repair. And it came body only. But I had a battery and a charger from the 1DX, so I went for it. And when it arrived, this thing, it did not immediately work. That said, we're here to make a video on it, so let's get into it. What is the Canon 1D III? Well, it's this camera right here. And it's part of the 1D flagship series of cameras, with this one being the third generation. And it was released in May of 2007. The camera is equipped with a 10.1 megapixel APS-H CMOS sensor. That's 1.3 times crop factor. Features an EF mount, obviously, and it's good for ISO 100 to 3200 or with expansion enabled 50 to 6400. Shutter is good for 30 seconds to 1/8000th of a second, and it's rated for 300,000 shutter clickety-clacks. Flash sync is 1/300th of a second, and autofocus is handled by a 45-point system, with 19 of those points being selectable cross types and 26 being what Canon call assist points. The camera's metering is done by a 63-point or zone system, and at the rear of the camera you have a 3-inch 230 kDot display. And obviously on top there's an OVF since it's a DSLR. It covers 100% of the field of view approximately and has a magnification of 0.76 times. The 1D III features both CF card and SD card slots for memory, and it can shoot it up to 10 FPS for 30 RAWs. It uses the chunky LPE4 battery, and it's rated for 2200 CPA rated shots. That's without live view, by the way. And with the battery and an SD card, this camera weighs in at 1350 grams. That's a lot, more than a Plena. When it was new, this camera cost 4,000 USD, or roughly 6,169 now bucks, roughly 8,600 Maple Goose bucks. What's up with my 1D III? I did say I bought mine body only, and it was stated as being broken, sold for parts, and all the things. Now, again, when I got mine, I had a battery and a charger for mine, so I grabbed my battery from the 1DX that I have, and I chunked it in. And, you know, unfortunately, that's not the end of the story. It didn't magically pop to life. It unmagically, partially popped to life. When I chunked the battery in and turned the camera on, the sub-display and the rear sub-display were blank. When I looked in through the OVF, it looked like nothing was showing up, no overlays or anything like that. But the camera was on. I was able to enter the menu and manipulate things. When I half pressed, I could hear the autofocus beep. And if I, fully pressed, the shutter fired. So when I entered live view, the camera actually did work, and you could see the image. And again, things otherwise seemed to work. So I figure that the main board is a bit funky, or there's a connection that's a bit bunk. Possibly the controller that's running the sub-displays is having a bad day. So what do you do if a friend is having a bad day? A pep talk, affirmations, a pat on the back. I offered a pat on the back, or as I call it, percussive maintenance, as it were. I gave the camera a hard smack on the bottom, and lo and behold, the top displays came back to life. Now, this is not a permanent fix. Occasionally, it still decides to go blank, so I'll pop the battery out, followed by a little more percussive maintenance, and then all will be good for a while. Maybe later, I'll actually crack this thing open and see if I can figure it out, but, for now, when in doubt, beat it out. No, never mind. The Canon 1D3, a Canon with a few Canon achievements. The 1D3 was the first Canon DSLR to offer live view, and it was very rudimentary, really only used for framing, and it didn't even do exposure sim. It didn't do autofocus either, but it did allow for you to do punching in, offering up to a 10 times punch in, so it's actually not too bad, and kind of useful. Now, another thing that this camera was known for at the time, that it was billed as the world's fastest DSLR. And, it was able to flap its shuttery mechanical flappity bits at an impressive figure for the time. Unfortunately, that same year, that number was topped by the Nikon D3, which could do one more flappity flap than the 1D3, which was 11 flappity flaps to Canon's 10. Now, mind you, the D3 did this in DX mode. Anyways, back to the 1D. The 1D series, the 1D3, is the first 1D camera to move away from the classic control scheme that was the positive control, that is the press and hold to navigate, bringing the ease of use of the 10D series bodies to the 1D series professional proness. And this kind of had an effect of unifying the UI across the brand. More Canon firsts are that this is the first DSLR that Canon had that was rated for 300,000 shutter slappity slaps. Now, honestly, this is more of a Canon promise than anything else, but it's still pretty cool. Other things are that this is the first Canon DSLR to have the on-sensor automatic cleaning. Hello, this is future 50mm here. I just realized this next section coming up, there's some wrong info there. So I'm about to say the 1D Mark III is the first DSLR that does 14-bit RAWs. It is not. It is the first Canon DSLR that does 14-bit RAWs. The first non-medium format digital back system that did 14-bit RAWs was the Fujifilm S3. So yeah, just keep that in mind for the section immediately coming up. And the last thing, which I think is a bigger point than most people realize, is that the 1D3 is the first DSLR that wasn't a medium format camera to shoot 14-bit RAW files, breaking away from the 12-bit norm of the time. And before folks of Pentax get all up in arms, I'm aware that ye old Pentax cameras had the 22-bit A to D conversion in some CCD cameras, but it packs those in 12-bit RAWs, so, still 12 bits. So why was the 1D3 forgotten? Well, in short, the Nikon D3 and autofocus controversy or two. In long, in 2007, it was a hell of a year. Again, the 1D3 was announced and it looked good. An excellent evolution from the 1D2N, but unfortunately it wasn't revolutionary. There were a lot of nice moderate spec bumps, but then out of left field, Nikon announces the D3. This is my D3S, by the way, not the original one, but Nikon announces the D3 in August of 2007, a couple months after this was released. And Nikon storms in. It's Nikon's first full-frame camera, bringing Nikon back into the game. And it's 12 megapixels. Sure, it's less than the 1DS Mark II, but it packs a bunch of tricks. While it's not getting the 10 FPS of the 1D3, it's giving you 9 FPS at full-frame resolutions, one shy of the 1D3 and its APS-H-ness. And that's not the end of the story either. When the D3 made it onto the scene, the high ISO basically trounced the performance of the 1D3, and dynamic range was better too. All of this at a mere cost of an additional $250 from the 1D3 price. So many thunders were stolen from Canon. Next, it's likely that if you do remember the 1D3, it's not for a great reason. There were autofocus issues from the start. Canon even acknowledged this, and while they were trying to come up with solutions with some firmware, they did a service advisory where you would have to send your camera in to replace a mirror subassembly. And this affected quite a few units. I actually have an affected model number range, but they're definitely not offering that service nowadays. But, you know, it seems that mine is focusing relatively okay anyways. But anyway, that was a problem. And this AF problem persisted till 2009 when Canon announced another firmware update and an optional AF calibration that you could send in your camera to Canon for them to adjust it for you. And it seems that most of the times this worked out, but by the time 2009 rolled around, the 5D2 had already stole the lightning for, you know, the 1D series cameras, and everyone in the camera scene was looking at the 5D2. So there were just a lot of things that stole the thunder from the 1D3. Shooting with the Canon 1D3 operation and feel. The 1D3 is hunky, chunky, and ergonomically glorious. It is very chunky though. And just a fun fact, if you look closely at this camera, you can see that a bunch of the buttons, all the buttons have weather sealing. They have gaskets around them, and this is the norm for the 1D series, and it helps make this camera very robust. Now, combine the 1D robustness and build with the 10D UI, and you have a 1D Mark III that is now more approachable and easier to use than before. Now, when it comes to actually operating the camera, the 1D series has a pretty standard layout. You got your command dial behind your shutter button, and it's mirrored on the vertical grip with a chunky command dial in the back. Now, this camera has the benefit of being made after the Canon 30D, which means that it also has a AF joystick in the back of this camera. And that actually comes in handy since the camera has 19 selectable AF points. Now, this camera also has the top subdisplay and rear subdisplay under the main display panel, and it glows blue, which is very nice. One thing that isn't perfect about this camera though is that if you are using the camera and you need to use the bottom row of controls, I find that it's actually a little bit too low. I do prefer the placement on the 1DX where it's a little bit higher. That being said, when it comes to gripability, the grip on this camera is fantastic and the thumb perch is excellent. All the controls you could ever want can be accessed from your thumb or the index finger. The only thing that isn't as nice is the vertical grip. It's not as sculpted as the regular one, but overall pretty good. One thing I do like about the 1D cameras, and this particular 1D camera, there's no stupid direct print button. Very nice. Overall, the camera has a pretty modern feeling UI, again thanks to the cribbing from the 10D series. Now, this results in the button layout being pretty damn near perfect, with controls being easy to find and for the most part being very natural to access. One thing that I would say takes a bit of getting used to if you are not used to a 1 series body is this top row of buttons here, used for doing things like changing your drive modes or changing your shooting modes. But it's actually kind of similar to how Nikon does it with their pro bodies. So if you're used to that, you shouldn't have a problem with this. Plus, the big rear command dial on the 1D cameras just looks like it fits nicely. So overall, the camera is a joy to use, and goes without saying, the thumb dial, the rear command dial, is reachable whether or not you're in vertical grip or regular horizontal grippy modes. The only thing that isn't really mirrored in the vertical grip is that there is no second AF joystick for you to use on the vertical grip side. It's not a big problem though, since you can still select your AF point using the controls on the vertical grip. It's just going to be done through your command dials here and the rear one. It's not as good as the AF joystick, but it gets the job done. Now, being a DSLR, it has an OVF, obviously. And being an APS-H camera, it's a 1.3 times crop, but it's still an excellently large finder. And you get info displayed on both the bottom of the OVF and on the right side. So you get a lot of stuff on your OVF. Additionally, focus points are projected LEDs that light up instead of the LCD display on the 1DX, which does like darkening of the segment to indicate your focus spot. I happen to like this a little more. And lastly, when you are using the OVF, the actual OVF is offset a little farther back, so you get some distance between your face and the camera, so you're not always leaving smudges from your nose on the back display. The 1D's menus feel pretty familiar if you're a normal user of Canon cameras. It's honestly a fairly modern look, if not like, it's not as pretty as they currently are, but the layout is going to be familiar to most Canon users. And it's going to be also fairly easy to navigate. Basically, you can go left and right through your tabs and then up and down for the options within. Plus, being a 1D camera, there are tons of options for customization. And you can do things like disable or enable shooting modes, limit aperture ranges, shutter speeds, and all the other really nitpicky things on this camera. And again, because of the fact that they adopted the UI from the 10D series cameras, it's hard to get lost in the menus. That being said, because it is a 1D camera and you do get a lot of options to customize, you might find yourself digging through there to change and tweak things a little longer than you normally would. When it comes to actually looking at the rear display, it's actually one of the things I don't super like about this camera. I'm not sure if it's the way the dots are arranged, or if it's just because the resolution is kind of low for how large the display is. But I think generally things just kind of look a bit soft on it. It's not particularly nice, despite being 3 inches. And you know, mostly I'm fine with it. I just consider it an anti-chimping feature. Now, the last thing I do want to discuss with using this camera is the sensor size. I know this sounds like a image quality talking point, but it's not in a way. I want to talk with respect to how the camera feels with 1.3 times crop. It generally feels like a small crop, and I generally like it a lot, more so than APS-C, but it does, I admit, make for some weird, odd equivalent field of use. For example, 50 millimeters is equivalent to 65 millimeter field of view. 100 millimeters is around 130 millimeters. Those numbers feel pretty in between. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, 1.3 is between 1.0 and 1.5 or 1.6, but that's not quite it. When you put a 50 mil on APS-C, depending on the APS-C, you get 75 or 80 mil field of view. And that gets it pretty close to 85 millimeters. So you feel like you're getting a short, tight short telly. When you put a 35 millimeter on a APS-C camera, you get 52.5 mil, close to 50 mil. The APS-C crops tend to get you close to pretty standard focal lengths and feel a bit more natural, where the APS-H doesn't. It takes getting used to, but like I said, I do generally like it. Image quality and autofocus. The 1D3 has a 10.1 megapixel APS-H sensor, and it's a CMOS, of course. It's one of the few cameras that support this sensor size. And this sensor has an AA filter, so per pixel sharpness won't be as nice as modern contemporary cameras, but it will be relatively RA resistant. Being 10.1 megapixels, I find it's generally more than enough to cover most modern scenarios, from offering up images for mobile use to 4K displays. There's enough pixels there to do it, just not much cropping room. The APS-H sensor also offers another bonus, pixel pitch. It's pretty big, coming in at 7.2 microns. In the age of APS-C cameras with 40 megapixels, that's pretty big. And the side benefit of this is that it is less demanding on lenses. When it comes to dynamic range and noise, the advantage of the slightly bigger sensor comes in. This camera sensor is actually pretty solid. It, I think, performs pretty well compared to APS-C cameras of the time, and definitely performs, I think, competitively all the way through like the mid 2010s in terms of dynamic range for comparison against APS-C cameras. So you do get a bit of room to play with the image, and noise is also reasonably well controlled. Now, I'd happily shoot this camera at ISO 1600 or 3200, again, especially given modern noise reduction. The camera kind of limits you to 6400, but I find that at that point, this camera gets a bit dicey anyways, so I don't find myself wanting to shoot any higher with this camera. And to be honest, with a lot of even my newer cameras, I don't normally shoot above that anyways. I will if I need to, but I prefer not to. When it comes to autofocus, this camera is fast. No, it cannot do booger detect or sadness tracking, but for a conventional phase detect module, it's quick. Plus, if you can keep the target on like your focus point, it is generally going to be able to acquire focus and track it in most scenarios. I will say, in the past, I have actually used this to shoot sports. Back in my university days, I used it for basketball, volleyball, football, other ball-based sports. And at the time, and right now, I suppose, it focused very well. It is able to track the action, and I was able to get some pretty excellent shots. Again, newer cameras will do a better job, but it doesn't mean that this system all of a sudden became bad. It is still able to track action no problem. You just got to know how the system works and use it accordingly. Plus, it isn't or wasn't named the fastest camera around for nothing. So let's give that a go. That's a lot of shots. That's the stuff. This camera has a good chunkity chunk to its shutter sound. It's clearly not going to win any silent shooting competitions, but when it comes to the sound it makes when you shoot, that's really quite lovely. And given that this camera is quite a hefty tank, the actual shutter slap is pretty well dampened. You know, plus 10 FPS mechanical flappies, it's just pretty cool. conclusion. Would I recommend the 1D3? Honestly, no. And here's why. Price. The average rate for the 1D3 currently is kind of more than I thought if you want a working one. And it's around $250 in the low end, going as high as around $400. At that price, I'd recommend the 5D Mark II. The 1D3 is nice. It's a lot of fun, and that shutter sound is great. But the 5D2 has a few niceties that I think are worth considering. Full frame sensor, pretty awesome, and with that, the resolution bump. Plus, the LCD on the 5D2 in the back, it's just overall much nicer. Plus, the 1D3, being a 1D series camera, is genuinely a bit weighty. Now, where the 1D would make more sense is if you really wanted to sample APS-H sensor goodness, or you prioritize the 10 mechanical flappy shutters per second. But if you're really into sports shooting, you're definitely better off getting a entry-level mirrorless camera with on-sensor phase detect. That stuff is no joke, especially when combined with newer tracking algorithms. They're really impressive. But if you really wanted the 1D build quality, I'd probably consider the 1DS Mark II over the 1D3, since it's got the same solid build, a solid AF system. You just have to contend with the older UI. But you do get, again, full frame benefits, so there's things to be said for those. That said, if you wanted the 1D3 just for the vibes, as they say, go for it. It still takes great photos, and it's still an excellent camera to use with a solid AF system. But here is my question for you. Have any of you used this camera professionally? And if you did you experience any of the autofocus issues that had apparently plagued this camera? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.